Hello, and welcome to the Political Opinions podcast, where every opinion is given equal footing, and political tolerance and debate are given their proper attention in a world where both are on the decline. Today's episode will cover different opinions on punishment and rehabilitation. The debate on how to deal with criminals has existed for as long as there have been laws for them to break. The question of whether to punish criminals or rehabilitate them into society is fraught with division and argument on both sides. The central focus of this debate is whether the primary goal should be to punish these criminals and lock them away from society, or focus instead on helping them become law-abiding citizens again. In today's episode, we will unpick and compare these opinions. As this episode is not covering a simple agree-disagree division centred around one topic, it is important to mention that punishment and rehabilitation are not mutually exclusive. They can and do exist side by side in the criminal justice system. As a result of this, today's episode will cover which should be prioritised rather than chosen exclusively. It also means I will only be touching on a small proportion of this debate, and so please see the relevant links in the description for more detail. Quick reminder, the aim of this episode, as always, is not to try and argue for or against one side of the debate, but rather to highlight the different opinions on the topic and provide a comparison between them. With all that being said, I will begin with the arguments in favour of rehabilitation, followed by those preferring punishment, with a comparison at the end. The primary focus of rehabilitation is that it can help reduce the likelihood of reoffending once the criminal has been released from prison. To some, the goal should be to try and reduce crime via reducing the number of criminals, not necessarily locking them away. And given that most criminals are reoffenders, rehabilitation has long-term benefits. Long-term prison sentences often don't work, as criminals are more concerned with the present, and as such, stopping reoffenders before they leave prison is more effective. And essentially this is the belief around rehabilitation, that it is more effective at reducing crime by helping these people reintegrate to society rather than simply locking them away for longer. Rehabilitation would have the added benefit of reducing the cost of imprisonment over time. It is far cheaper to try and rehabilitate someone than it is to lock them up for an extended period of time. If the number of criminals is reduced, this will also mean that over time, less money will need to be spent on prisons, and as such, rehabilitation is more cost effective to some than punishment. Furthermore, often the individual who commits a crime is not entirely to blame. There are always other causes to crime. For example, people in poverty may be forced into thieving as a result of not being able to afford anything, it's pretty simple. And as a result, it is wrong to some to blame the individual entirely and punish them exclusively. Instead, because, to some at least, society and the state fail these individuals in some way to lead them to a life of crime, it should be our responsibility to not blame them and punish them, but help reintegrate them back into society. And extending from this, some believe that it is the morally correct thing to do, and they believe that rehabilitation is better than punishment in this regard. Some see it as perhaps old-fashioned to lean on heavily punitive measures, and given more awareness to the cause of crime that we have today, some believe that rehabilitation should be our focus rather than simply locking these people up, especially again considering that there is likely a wider reason than them just wanting to be a criminal. And rehabilitation can help integrate these people back into society, after prison at least, by giving them essential skills. If there is a rehab in prison, they are able to learn essential skills, develop as individuals, and that means that once they leave, they will not be desperate and forced back into a life of crime, but rather may be able to get a job, start settling down and living normally. And this provides an added benefit of being beneficial to the economy. Again, the cost of prison is quite high, but if you are able to reduce the number of criminals and put these people into work, they can work, pay taxes, buy things, and all of this is quite beneficial. And it also means that less money will be spent over time on policing, courts, etc. And finally, rehabilitation can protect society by reducing the actual reoffending rate. Most criminals will be released from prison at some point if they aren't serving, for example, I don't know, a few thousand years. So if someone's kept in prison 5 years longer for a minor-ish crime, but then, the second they're released, because they've been punished rather than rehabilitated, they're more likely to go and recommit that crime. It is worse for society. However, if we have the ability to help integrate these people back in society and become law-abiding citizens, over time especially, society in general will become safer. Now, for those who would prefer punishment, some people believe it is a better way to dissuade from future crime through punitive measures. If there is a large cost of being caught in the form of a harsh prison sentence or high fines, for example, this has a benefit of essentially increasing the risk of crime. It's an argument that if criminals, potential criminals at least, see the heavy costs involved in certain crimes, they are less likely to go and commit them. Now, this doesn't necessarily extend to everyone. For example, if you're a murderer, chances are you're not concerned about a prison sentence. But if you're going to rob a bank, for example, you may be more concerned with high levels of punishment afterwards, at least. Some people also believe that rehabilitation doesn't work. Many criminals, or in fact a large proportion of them, do reoffend regardless of rehabilitation or not, and as such, to some the cost of rehab is wasted. It is easier to lock up a persistent offender continually for a long period of time than have to deal with a continuous cycle of releasing them, policing them, sentencing them, dealing with them in prison, rehabbing them again for the cycle to continue. And as such, instead, we should just punish them rather than keep and trying to and failing essentially in rehabilitating them into society. Some also believe that criminals themselves are responsible for their actions. For at least adults, they are almost always aware of what they are doing and choose to do it anyway. Given these people did not seek avenues of societal help, for example benefits, and instead chose crime, even if they were, for example, being in poverty and forced to crime, they still made that choice to commit crime, and therefore should be punished and not supported by society. Some people also believe it is the morally right thing to do in terms of providing justice for the victims and providing retribution for the criminals. If someone's car was stolen, it's probably better for them to know that the criminal who did it was punished rather than simply released and potentially rehabilitated. If we support prisoners more than we punish them, it can lead innocent people to feel as if they are not being helped. And also, given it's taxpayers' money and the victims' money going towards rehabilitation and punishment, then there's an argument essentially that many more people would rather see their money being spent on punishing the people who have wronged them. Criminals also struggle to find jobs because people do not want to hire them. Admittedly, this is a stigma, but some people very reasonably don't want to hire former criminals for certain jobs. And as such, some people say rehabilitating them with skills, over punishing them at least, is a waste of time. Again, this isn't a we shouldn't rehabilitate them, but it's a we should focus more on punishing these people. And as such, to some, the economy isn't helped by rehabilitating them, as again, they question whether or not it even works to begin with. And as such, we should fight crime before it happens, and punish crime after it has been committed, not be sympathetic to the people who have committed the crime. And finally, punishment and long prison sentences are designed to protect society from criminals. It is safer to have a violent criminal locked away for sure than hoping that once they are released from prison, they won't simply go back to a life of crime. Moving on now to a comparison. On the question of which approach is better at actually reducing crime, well, those supporting rehabilitation believe that it reduces the likelihood of reoffending, as over time they will be taught more skills and be better able to integrate back into society. If it's a personal reason they have committed crime and they're rehabilitated to realise what they did was wrong, they won't commit the crime again. And if it was desperation and they're given skills to get a job, again they won't do it again. And as such, some people believe that rehabilitation is better, especially on the point that most criminals probably don't care about the punitive measures in place once they have been caught. Again, people commit crime regardless, thus meaning that no matter how essentially high you have the punishment level being, a lot of people simply won't care. However, those on the other side believe that deterrence of long prison sentences does reduce the risk of crime. If you increase the cost of crime, a lot of people in many different areas will simply not want to risk it, especially knowing that stealing a car may land you many years in prison. It's more likely to disincentivize you. And also, these people don't believe that rehabilitation works. Given so many criminals reoffend, they argue it's better to keep them locked up for longer, therefore there's no chance of them committing a crime because they're in prison, than hoping that they won't commit crime once they have been released. On the question of what is the best approach, morally at least, those supporting rehabilitation believe that society and the state failed these individuals. There's a reason they had a life of crime. There was a story in London recently of a black male who was once involved in a gang and left the gang, and the reason he actually said he was involved was because at that point of time it was easier to join a gang than it was to get a job. And that's just synonymous with this whole idea that there's often wider reasons for crime beyond the individuals themselves, and as such, given that society does play a part, it is also society and the state's responsibility to help integrate these people back into society. However, those on the other side believe that these people know what they're doing. They know the choice, and as such, we should care more about the victims. The morally correct thing to do, therefore, is to provide justice and retribution. Rehabilitation makes the focus on the criminal, not the victim. However, to these people, the victim is the one we should be caring about more. And to people supporting this side, many of them would feel safer knowing that, for example, a person who assaulted them was in prison, not they are potentially being rehabilitated. On the question of what is the best approach economically, those supporting rehabilitation argue that by reducing prison populations over time due to rehab cutting down reoffending rates, we cut the costs on the criminal justice system. And there is a benefit that former criminals can get jobs and re-enter society. Therefore, there's an economic benefit and a reduction in economic costs, and as such, economically, rehabilitation makes more sense, especially given the high costs of imprisonment long term. Those on the other side, however, believe that there is a higher cost to policing and sentencing consistent reoffenders than it is to simply keep them locked away for a long period of time. And also, these people may point beyond society. They may say that, oh yes, although it may be cheaper to try to rehabilitate people, the costs once they have committed a crime are far higher than the costs of keeping them interned in prison for a long period of time. And they also believe that criminals may not potentially get jobs, for example, and as such, a lot of the money just go to waste. On the question of who is actually to blame for these crimes, well, those supporting rehabilitation argue that the criminal often has a reason for committing crime. Again, they're not talking about people who are, for example, mentally ill and then go around murdering someone, but rather someone who is in dire situations, and as such they need to steal in order to have enough money to survive. It is society and the state, again, who did not help these people entirely, and given that the state is punishing them for that, some people argue that it is wrong. However, those supporting punishment believe that criminals are aware of what they do. We shouldn't give them our sympathy. They don't deserve our sympathy. They ignored other avenues of help and resorted to crime, and as such, to these people, the result of that is that they should be punished. And finally, on the question of what actually protects our society in the best way, well, those supporting rehab argue that by reducing reoffending rates, society is better protected by cutting the amount of criminals over time. For example, if someone is in prison for 5 years longer, but the second they get out, they go and commit crime again, that is more harmful than having them be released early, but having them be rehabilitated into society. However, those supporting punishment believe that society is better protected by having these people locked away. There's no way someone can commit crime when they are in prison, in theory at least, and as such, it's safer to keep people locked away for longer periods of time than simply hoping that they will not commit a crime again. Overall then, those who want to prioritise rehabilitation focus more on the role of society to help these people reintegrate back into society. They believe that the individual is not entirely to blame, and rehabilitation provides more benefits than long-term arbitrary punishment, and question the effectiveness of punishing people in the long run. Those preferring punishment, however, question the effectiveness of rehabilitation, and believe more in retribution for the crimes offenders have committed. We should lock these people away and not try to help them. They committed the crime, and it should be them who face the consequences of their actions. The current approach to prison in general has been to apply a mixture of rehabilitation and punishment. It seems to depend more on the crime committed. For example, violent crimes are punished far more heavily in relation to minor crimes such as non-violent burglary. With the rise of populism, however, society seems to be moving towards more harsh punishments rather than rehabilitation. However, we will have to wait and see where we go next. Ultimately though, what do you think on this issue? Do you believe we should focus more on rehabilitation or punishment? Do you believe one of them is more effective at reducing crime? And what do you believe is the purpose of prison? Is it to provide justice, to provide retribution, or to act as an avenue for reintegration once they have been caught? And from my point of view, is there anything that I missed, got wrong, or could do better? Let me know in the comments or on Twitter, and be sure to check back on Monday for another episode. Thank you for listening, and I hope to see you all soon.